And here we go from the national headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital. Hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. What happens when a country like ours, the United States, intervenes in the affairs of another? What happens after the intervention? We pose this question because as we speak, the United States State Department, the Office of National Security Advisor, and the White House are signaling, using either direct or implied threats, that it is prepared to intervene in Iran, in Venezuela. What can possibly go wrong, you ask? Well, just about everything, right? Listen to President Obama. This is President Obama when he was asked by Fox News' Chris Wallace what his biggest mistake was during his presidency.
Probably failing to plan for the day after what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya.
Intervening in Libya. The president is right. Post-Gaddafi, Libya has been locked in a state of violence that has continued for some 8 years. The country has remained divided. On one side are government officials in Tripoli who were sanctioned by the United Nations. On the other side, a renegade general named Khalifa Haftar. We've told you about him on several occasions here on this newscast. He has declared the government of Tripoli void, as in non-existent, while he calls the shots from Tobruk. Now, the biggest fear, of course, is that Libya is going to spin out of control, turning it into another Syria or another Iraq. Why is Libya important? Geographically, because it sits in a place that makes it the gateway to the Mediterranean and to Europe from Africa. Right? See it right there? Look at that. Look where it goes. Anybody coming in from Africa going north pretty much has to go through Libya. That's economics. And also, just looking at it in terms of pure numbers, because it has the largest oil reserves in Africa. That's important. This is the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe in drilling down on stories like this when often most don't, because it is time to do news again. Look at what could happen in Libya and why it's important. You know, it's funny because in many ways, it all begins in Benghazi, right? And to most American news consumers anyway, Benghazi is simply a place that set off a political firestorm between Republicans and Democrats when a U.S. ambassador was killed there. If you asked, in fact, most Americans, they likely would not be able to find Benghazi on a map, nor would they be able to even tell you that it's in Libya. In fact, Benghazi is where the very first uprisings took place as a result of the Arab Spring that eventually led to the downfall of Muammar Gaddafi and his 41-year rule. 41 years. Think about that. Well, it ended with the United States and the British intervening using no less than Tomahawk missiles to help overthrow Gaddafi and help create a transitional government, hoping somehow that transitional government would be able to put all the pieces back together again. But it never seems to work out that way. Joining us now in News with Rick Sanchez correspondent Michele Greenstein. And I guess I have to ask the question, so how's that intervention thing going?
Not great unless you're a fan of open-air slave markets. There's widespread torture and assassination happening in the country, and according to a UN report that just came out last December, rampant gang rape as well. So that NATO bombing, invasion, and occupation really destroyed the standard of living in this country. It destroyed health infrastructure, hospitals, its water distribution system. But it's going well if you're someone like the World Bank or the IMF that wants to help rebuild this now failed state.
Why are these things happening there? Just there's no stability in the government or the control or the security?
Well, not only is there no stability in the government, there's a question as to who the government is. We have a two-government system now. Yeah. One is the U.S.-backed government, the UN-backed government, right. And the other is the one that you mentioned, led by Mr. Khalifa Haftar. So we have two governments, one in Tripoli and one in Tobruk. And
Khalif is really, he's a renegade, right? I mean, this is a guy, he's, I guess, a rebel. He's going in there, guns a-blazing, and he wants to take Tripoli down and start a new government. He thinks they're ineffective.
You know, there's a lot to say about him, actually. He actually started fighting in Gaddafi's army. He was even involved in the coup that led to Gaddafi coming to power. He was taken prisoner by Chad in that conflict between the two countries, and that's when he actually connected with U.S. intelligence, where he trained with the CIA's paramilitary arm, their Special Operations Division. And in 1990, the U.S. actually flew him and about 300 others to the U.S. and gave him refugee status. And then he lived right here in Virginia, or close by here in Virginia, until 2011, when, you know, that humanitarian intervention was launched and Gaddafi was overthrown and killed. This is when he tried to rise to power, but the Islamists that were in the newly elected government didn't want to give power to anyone who was at any time loyal to Gaddafi. So he failed, and, you know, he went back to Virginia. But then in 2014, came back and again tried to take power. He said that the Islamist militias that were controlling the country were spreading a lot of violence. And a lot of people in Libya see him as someone who took initiative where others failed, where he's actually trying to combat these violent extremist groups.
The biggest fear is that it can turn into a completely destabilized area akin to like Assyria.
Right.
Is that a major concern?
Well, it's interesting because you have a lot of U.S. corporate press now calling on the Trump administration to act fast. You know, Libya is in an unstable situation. But, of course, it was Western intervention that led to this in the first place.
So we, in a sense, I think what I just heard you say is we kind of destabilized it.
I don't know if you could even say kind of. We definitely destabilized it.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons we did so was because Libya under Gaddafi, the Libyan government, was preparing to institute a gold-backed currency that was going to totally change the world economy, of course, threaten a little bit of the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. And it was going to be a pan-African currency that would also rival France's influence in the entire continent. So there are a lot of reasons that, you know, NATO wanted to quote-unquote intervene. Another reason is, of course, the simple one. We did, of course, want Libya's oil. And this has been confirmed by State Department emails that, you know, came out a few years ago.
I mentioned in the lead that it was geographically almost perfectly placed as the gateway into the Mediterranean and into Europe,
right,
as well as the fact, and it has the largest oil reserves,
yes,
in all of Africa.
In terms of natural resources, this is a very wealthy country. And what's interesting is before Gaddafi, this was one of the poorest nations in Africa. And then when we get to the time he was assassinated, it was Africa's wealthiest nation. So not only did he nationalize the oil and give that oil wealth to the Libyan people, but life expectancy was raised, literacy went up, housing was considered a human natural right, electricity was free, education and medical treatment were free, and it had the highest GDP per capita on the continent, with less people living below the poverty line than they did in the Netherlands.
Should we be concerned that this thing will spin out of control? And what are the chances that the government right now, who we've been trying to reach out to, by the way, and we're hoping they'll be able to come on our show and answer some of our questions about this, what are the chances this government in Tripoli is going to be able to control this situation, quell this situation, so it doesn't spin out of control?
Well, the U.S. is definitely concerned. Even the Washington Post ran this headline that said, former CIA Assad has become a headache in Libya, referring to Mr. Haftar. The UN-backed government, though, of course sees him as a threat. He's the main other power faction in this country. But something else that we need to understand is that even though you see a lot of corporate press calling for Trump to, you know, step up and do something because the region is being destabilized, it was Western intervention that did this to begin with. And the one thing that Western intervention tends to do is lay the groundwork for future destabilization that, of course, leads to, you know, justification for more intervention.
And what do we call that?
Blowback. And maybe by design it may not be, but that's definitely the effect it's having.
I can't believe we both said that word together and it wasn't even scripted.
It wasn't planned, everyone, I swear.
Thank you, Michele.
Thanks.
I'm Rick Sanchez. You found us on YouTube, and that's awesome. But you know what? I'm also live every night at 7 and 8 p.m. Eastern on DirecTV and Dish and cable and satellite, the RT app, and Pluto TV. I'll see you there.